The low, resonant hum reverberated through the cold metal walls of the Erebus, a sound that seemed to crawl into the bones of everyone aboard. Dr. Elena Voss stood frozen, her gloved hand hovering over the artifact's surface as the glow intensified, casting jagged shadows across the dimly lit chamber. Around her, the crew staggered, clutching their heads as visions of impossible shapes and writhing darkness flooded their minds. One by one, they collapsed, their screams swallowed by the growing hum. Voss's voice broke through the chaos, barely audible, trembling with dread. "We shouldn't have done this," she whispered, her breath fogging in the icy air. The artifact pulsed brighter, its light seeping into the ship's corridors like a living thing, and somewhere in the void beyond, something stirred. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ship's hull, as if the Erebus itself were screaming. And then the whispers began. As the artifact's glow intensified, the Erebus began to unravel. Lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters across the walls. The ship's systems, once reliable, now sputtered and failed in rapid succession. Alarms blared, their shrill tones drowned out by the deepening hum that seemed to emanate from the very core of the vessel. Dr. Voss stumbled back from the artifact, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The whispers came next, soft at first, like the rustle of distant leaves, but growing louder, more insistent. They weren't heard through the ears but felt within the mind, a chorus of voices urging, pleading, demanding. "Open the gate." The crew, already reeling from the initial shock, now found themselves besieged by these invasive whispers. Some clutched their heads, their faces twisted in agony, while others stared blankly, their eyes glazed as if entranced. Dr. Voss, fighting to maintain her composure, turned her attention back to the artifact. Its surface, once smooth and unmarked, now bore intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under her gaze. She traced them with trembling fingers, her training as a xenolinguist kicking in. The symbols formed a message, one that sent a chill down her spine. The sleeper stirs. Meanwhile, chaos spread through the ship. Crew members began to act erratically, their behavior growing more unpredictable by the minute. One engineer, a man named Harris, was found carving the same cryptic symbols into the walls of the engineering bay. His eyes were wild, his movements frantic, as if driven by some unseen force. When confronted, he simply muttered, "It's calling to me," before disappearing into the ship's labyrinthine ventilation system. His absence left a void, but the whispers filled it, growing louder, more pervasive, until they seemed to echo from every corner of the Erebus. The tension aboard the ship became unbearable. The crew, once a cohesive unit, now fractured under the weight of their shared terror. Some argued for destroying the artifact, while others, influenced by the whispers, insisted it was the key to their salvation. Dr. Voss, caught between fear and curiosity, knew one thing for certain: they had awakened something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. And as the whispers grew to a deafening crescendo, she couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact was no longer just an object. It was a harbinger, a bridge to something unimaginable. The sleeper was stirring, and the Erebus was caught in its wake. As the Erebus drifted further into the void, the ship suddenly lurched, its engines groaning under an unseen force. The crew scrambled to their stations, their faces pale with dread as the ship was pulled inexorably toward a massive, pulsating rift in space. The anomaly loomed ahead, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The artifact, now glowing with an eerie intensity, hummed in sync with the rift, as if the two were somehow connected. Dr. Voss gripped the edge of the console, her mind racing. "We're being pulled in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to decide now, do we destroy the artifact or use it to escape? The crew erupted into chaos, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and desperation. Some argued vehemently for destroying the artifact, convinced it was the source of their torment. Others, their minds clouded by the whispers, insisted it was their only hope of survival. Dr. Voss, her voice cutting through the noise, warned, "If we destroy it, we might unleash what's inside. We don't know what we're dealing with." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The artifact was no mere object, it was a key, a bridge to something far beyond their comprehension. As the Erebus drew closer to the rift, the ship's artificial intelligence began to malfunction. The once reliable system now displayed cryptic messages across every screen. "They are coming," "The sleeper sees you," and "Prepare for the end." The words flickered ominously, their meaning unclear but their intent unmistakable. Panic spread through the crew like wildfire, their fragile unity crumbling under the weight of their shared terror. One crew member, a young engineer named Foretell, stepped forward. "I can stabilize the ship," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, "but it'll take everything I've got." Without waiting for a response, Foretell rushed to the engineering bay, her hands flying over the controls. The ship shuddered violently as she worked, her face pale but determined. Moments later, the Erebus stabilized, but the cost was devastating. Foretell slumped over the console, her breath shallow. As the crew gathered around her, she whispered, her voice barely audible, "It's too late, they're already here." Her words sent a chill through the room, a grim confirmation of their worst fears. The rift began to widen, its edges rippling like liquid darkness. Through the growing void, monstrous, otherworldly forms began to emerge, shapeless, writhing masses that defied comprehension. Their presence was felt before they were seen, a suffocating weight that pressed down on the crew's minds. Dr. Voss stared into the rift, her heart pounding. She knew they were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting to keep something unimaginable from breaking through into their reality. The sleeper was no longer stirring, it was awakening, and the Erebus was caught in its grasp. As the Erebus teetered on the edge of the widening rift, the crew scrambled to devise a plan. Dr. Voss, her mind racing, proposed a desperate solution. "We need to reverse the artifact's energy flow," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "If we can destabilize the rift from our side, we might be able to seal it before it's too late." The crew, though terrified, nodded in agreement. There was no other choice, they had to act now. The artifact, now pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, was connected to the ship's power grid. Dr. Voss and her team worked feverishly to reroute the energy, their hands trembling as they input the commands. The ship groaned under the strain, its systems flickering as the artifact began to draw power at an alarming rate. The hum of the artifact grew louder, resonating through the corridors like a heartbeat. For a moment, it seemed as though their plan might work. The rift's edges began to ripple, its chaotic energy faltering. But then something shifted, the artifact's glow intensified, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the ship, shaking the very walls. "You have trespassed where you do not belong," it boomed, its tone both ancient and alien. The crew froze, their blood running cold. Dr. Voss stared at the artifact, her eyes wide with realization. "It's not just a key," she whispered, "it's a lock. And we've just woken up the Guardian." The entity on the other side of the rift began to stir, its presence overwhelming. The ship's systems went haywire, alarms blaring as the lights flickered and died. Through the viewscreen, the crew could see the rift expanding, its edges now writhing with tendrils of darkness. The entity was breaking through, its formless mass oozing into the Erebus. The air grew thick, suffocating, As the tendrils crept through the ship's corridors, searching, consuming, one by one, the crew fell. A technician screamed as a tendril wrapped around his leg, dragging him into the shadows. Another crew member, her eyes wide with terror, vanished into the darkness without a sound. The ship's corridors echoed with the sounds of their screams, a horrifying symphony of despair. Dr. Voss and the remaining crew fought to maintain control, but it was a losing battle. The entity was too powerful, its reach too vast. In the engineering bay, the artifact began to crack, its surface glowing with an unnatural light. Dr. Voss knew they were running out of time. "We have to collapse the rift," she shouted over the chaos. "If we don't, it'll consume everything." The crew, their faces pale with fear, rallied around her. Together, they input the final commands, the ship's systems straining under the weight of the artifact's energy. The rift began to shudder, its edges collapsing inward as the entity roared in defiance. But the cost was devastating. The artifact shattered, its energy exploding in a blinding flash. The Erebus was thrown violently, its hull groaning under the strain. When the light faded, the rift was gone, but so was the artifact, and so were many of the crew. Dr. Voss, her hands trembling, stared at the empty space where the artifact had been. The ship was silent, the air heavy with the weight of their loss, but in the silence, a whisper lingered, faint but unmistakable: "The sleeper will awaken again." The Erebus drifted in the void, its systems barely functioning. The surviving crew members, their faces hollow with grief, gathered in the command center. They had survived, but at what cost? The artifact was gone, but the whispers remained, a chilling reminder that their ordeal was far from over. The sleeper had been awakened, and its presence lingered, a shadow over their fragile reality. The crew knew one thing for certain: they had trespassed where they did not belong, and the consequences would haunt them forever. As the Erebus drifted silently through the void, the weight of their ordeal pressed heavily on the surviving crew. The ship, battered and barely functional, was a grim reminder of the price they had paid. The artifact was gone, but its absence offered no comfort. Instead, it left a haunting void, a silence that seemed to hum with the echoes of what they had unleashed. The crew gathered in the dimly lit command center, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. They had survived, but the cost was immeasurable. The whispers, faint but persistent, lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that their battle was far from over. In the aftermath, the salvage team that discovered the Erebus found a ship adrift in the cold expanse of space. The logs, fragmented and cryptic, told a story of desperation and horror. The artifact was missing, its fate unknown, and the crew's final moments were shrouded in mystery. The salvage team, unaware of the true nature of what they had stumbled upon, began to piece together the events that had transpired. But as they delved deeper into the logs, they too began to hear the whispers, soft, insidious, and impossible to ignore. The sleeper's presence, though distant, was undeniable. Dr. Voss's final act had sealed the rift, but it had not destroyed the artifact. Instead, it had vanished, taken by forces beyond their understanding. The whispers, once confined to the Erebus, now seemed to spread, carried on the currents of space itself. The salvage team, now infected by the same dread that had consumed the crew, realized too late that they had become part of a cycle they could not escape. The artifact, the key to the void, was out there, and with it, the promise of the sleeper's return. The story of the Erebus became a cautionary tale, a warning whispered among those who dared to venture into the unknown. But warnings, no matter how dire, are often ignored. The allure of discovery, the promise of knowledge, is a siren call too powerful to resist. And so, the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing moment, a harbinger of the cosmic horror that lay dormant, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to awaken it. As the salvage team prepared to leave the Erebus behind, one final entry in the ship's logs caught their attention. It was a message from Dr. Voss, recorded in her final moments. Her voice, though weak, carried a weight of certainty. "The sleeper will awaken again," she said, her words echoing through the empty corridors of the ship. "And when it does, there will be no escape. We were wrong to think we could control it. We were wrong to think we could stop it. The void is not ours to conquer. It is ours to fear." The salvage team, now burdened with the knowledge of what lay ahead, left the Erebus behind, their ship disappearing into the vastness of space. But the whispers followed them, a constant reminder of the horror they had encountered. The artifact, the key, the lock, it was out there, waiting, and with it, the sleeper, stirring in the depths of the void, biding its time. The cosmic horror they should never have awakened was far from finished, and the whispers, faint but growing, were a promise of its inevitable return.